Hello and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Drea Renee Knits, and let's jump into some questions. Today I am wearing the Traveler Shawl. This is one of 4 patterns in the Traveler series right now, and this is one of my shawls. This is size A and it's knit up in my hand spun, which I believe is all fiber from Hello Yarn. And I did it in a combo spin and I love it. All right, question time. I'm currently knitting on a cardigan for my daughter where the body and arms are knit in garter stitch with a double knit hem / cuff in stockinette at the end. I decided to work the arms flat, but decided to sew the arms up before knitting the double knit cuff in the round. Since the wool I used is quite forgiving, I don't see a great gap where I did the switch from working flat to working in the round, but I was wondering if there's a better way or anything to look out for when doing it this way, since I might do this again in the future. Or is this a big no-no and you're shaking your head in disbelief right now? Not at all. I think, again, I've said this before, but I think one of the best parts about being a knitter, and I'm sure it applies to many other creative outlets, is that we get to figure out how to do things in our own way to bring us the most joy and the results that we're seeking to get. So one thought I have here that I'm really curious about is, have you seamed that sleeve before you started knitting the cuff in the round? And if you didn't, that would be my only thing to consider in the future, because what's going to happen is when you, and this is going to be a mute point if you already thought ahead and did this, but I'll cover this anyways. If you did rewind, when you go to seam that sleeve, your seam's gonna eat up a couple stitches, at least 2, at least 1 on each edge. So when you seam that up, those are gonna get eaten up and they'll be on the inside of the sleeve. And what's gonna happen is, if you haven't seamed it yet and you've already joined that cuff in the round, you could have a little pucker where those stitches got eaten up and are no longer there, but they're still there in your cuff, if that makes sense. So what I would do if it were me is I would put your live stitches on hold and I would seam up that sleeve. And then I would return the stitches to the needle, or you could, I suppose, just leave the stitches on the needle. They might just kind of be in your way when you're seaming. That's why I would think to put them on hold, but you can leave them on your needle. But then I would go ahead and join that cuff to work in the round. And if you notice a little gap where you seamed up, you could even pick up 1 or 2 stitches in the little gap just to have it look really smooth and tidy. But that would be the only thing I would think of. Otherwise, I don't see any problem with knitting the sleeve flat and then deciding to switch to in the round. Obviously, you could choose to also knit the cuff flat and just seam the whole shebang, but there's nothing wrong with the way you're doing it either. Question number 2. I was just watching your tutorials for combination knitting on ribbing. So I'm just gonna pause right here because I don't think I mentioned this last week. They all become a blur. So if I didn't mention it, I finally, after like a year of promising, recorded some video tutorials on knitting ribbing using combination knitting. I'm so thirsty I could chug this whole thing right now. Why do I get so thirsty when I do this? Okay, so quick overview. When we knit ribbing, we have our knits and our purls. No matter what style you knit in, generally speaking, the way we wrap our yarn around the needle uses up more yarn when purling than it does when we knit. That's why there's an uneven tension. That's why some people can row out when they're knitting stockinette stitch flat, because their purls are bigger than their knits, which I always find so interesting. So I'm like, but the purl is the back of the knit stitch. But it's the way we wrap our yarn when we create the stitches that causes the difference. So when we're knitting ribbing especially, it can become really obvious, because what happens is we have these columns of knits and these columns of purls. They don't use up the same amount of yarn. And so then we have this uneven tension, which can cause this kind of sloppy looking ribbing where we'll have one leg of that rib stitch kicking out. If I said all this last week, I may have. My apologies. Here's a refresher. But combination knitting simply wraps the yarn a different way than we traditionally do it, so that it uses a little bit less yarn, getting it closer to what we use for the knit stitch, tidying up that ribbing for us so that it's more even tension. So there are tutorials for that. I filmed 3. I did 1 in the round, and then I did 2 flat. For the flat ones, I did completely separate tutorials for English style and continental style knitting. The one in the round also covers both those styles of knitting. It's just in one bigger tutorial. So anyways, I'll link those in because I definitely don't think I linked them last week. And now I will finish with this question. All right, I was just watching your tutorials for combination knitting on ribbing, and I was curious about using this technique for knitting stockinette flat. When I first started knitting, I learned English style, but found it hurt my hands and switched to continental. When I switched, I was actually purling the way you were in your combination tutorial. At the time, I didn't know enough to realize my stitches were twisted or how to fix it, but now I'm wondering if I use this method for flat stockinette, could it prevent rowing out? Have you tried this? You could absolutely try to use that for fixing rowing out. Again, you're going to do the same thing I showed in those videos where when you go to work that stitch again. So for your purls, we are going to wrap the yarn underneath the needle. It doesn't matter if you're knitting English style, holding the yarn in your right hand, or continental style, holding the yarn in your left hand. You're still going to wrap that yarn underneath the needle tip when you go to purl. And where traditionally most of us would have been taught to wrap the yarn over the top of that needle when we go to purl. So what happens is when we wrap the yarn under the needle tip and then work the purl, it twists the stitch. So it's mounted. So we usually have a knitting needle. I'm gonna pretend my spindle's a knitting needle. And we usually have the stitch, you know, is like this, sitting on the needle. Well, when we come across it, we usually have, we want to knit through like the front of the leg, and so the front of the stitch is forward closest to the needle tip. But when we do that combination knitting, the back leg, and it ends up being mounted the opposite way like this, so that the back leg is closer to the needle tip. So all you have to do is work that next stitch through its back loop, whether it's knitting or purling, whatever you need to do on the follow-up row, which is dependent on if you're knitting flat or in the round. You just have to work the stitch through the back loop. So you don't have to worry too much, as long as you can, if you're able to know, because you've been knitting for a little while, which way that stitch is mounted. So if the front leg is closer to the needle tip, you knit through the front leg. If the back leg is closer to the needle tip, then you knit through the back leg or purl through the back leg. So yes, you could use that for rowing out, and you would just basically, when you are on the, if you're gonna have stockinette stitch be the front of your work, that would be your knits. So when you are on your wrong side purling rows, you would do that technique of wrapping the yarn under your needle tip. On the next row, you would end up needing to knit all those stitches through the back loop, and that would untwist all your stitches while still giving you probably closer, more even tension. Other ideas for if you row out. So if you don't know what we're talking about when we say row out, again, it's this whole the purls use more yarn than the knits conundrum. And some of you might not experience this. I did when I was an English knitter, which is funny. It tends to, and I say tends, it can happen to anybody, but a lot of times it's continental knitters who experience it a bit more because their purls can be even looser than an English knitter. And again, it's just the way we knit. Continental style knitting is generally a bit of a looser way to knit than English style knitting, which can be a bit tighter. So that's one thing in general to try out if you are struggling with tensioning. If you have a really hard time hitting gauge in a pattern to the point where it's frustrating, you're like, I can't, there's no more needles to size down to fix this issue, or whatever it may be, you could always try learning a different way to knit. So you could, if you're English, you could try out continental. If you're continental, you could try out English, and that might fix some tensioning issues. But rowing out is when you are knitting stockinette stitch, which I do not have on right now. And unfortunately, do not have an example near me. But, you know, just straight up knits on one side, purls on the other. And what happens is when we're knitting in the round, rowing out isn't a problem because of the fact that we are only ever working on one side of our work. So we're not flipping from knits to purls, because we're staying on the same side of our work. So we're just knitting, 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 etc. When we work that flat on the right side of our work, the front of our work, we knit. Once we flip it over to work the next row, we're on the back side of our work and we have to purl. So when we purl and we use a different amount of yarn than we did with our knits, it will cause what we call rowing out or ridges in our work. So when you look at your plain stockinette stitch fabric, you'll notice this kind of ridge happening. And it's because every other row, your stitches are different sizes. So this could be a really great way to try and fix that. Other helpful ways to try and fix this would include using a different needle size for your purl rows compared to your knit rows. Most people, when this is happening, I'm going to say for the 8 millionth time, is because their purls are bigger than their knits. So you would want to go either down a needle size for your purls, or you could go up a needle size for your knits, depending on what you need to do for your gauge. That being said, as one of the unicorns in the room, when I used to have an issue with purling out, it was actually because I was strangling my purls to death. And it was my purls being too tight that were causing the issue. So you have to figure out what your issue is. Are your knits bigger than your purls, or your purls bigger than your knits? Most likely it's the purls being bigger, but just be open that if these things aren't fixing it, it might be that your knits are the issue. So change a needle size on one end. It's really great if you have interchangeable needles, because you can just swap out one end to a different size, so that, you know, on your right side with your smaller needle tip, on your wrong side, you're always using your smaller needle for your purls, and then you turn your work and you're at the other end of your needle and it's your bigger needle to work your knits. So that's just a really easy way to do it. I just kind of blanked out on my other ways to fix it. Different size needle tips. Huh. Just went. See you later. Yeah, or try combination knitting. I don't know. All my other quick fixes that I always give for rowing out just left my mind. So let's go on to the next question. If you try out that combination knitting with your rowing out, please let us know if it works. I'm sure other people would love to know as a possible fix for them as well. Question number 3. I'm wondering about how different weight yarn affect fit. Y'all had such interesting questions this week. I'm like, ooh, these are some new ones. So, not so much for substitutions, I get that part, but for measuring an existing garment. Right now I have a cardigan I knit out of super bulky yarn. I really like the fit, and I have my eye on another cardigan pattern, which is a similar style, but it's with sport weight yarn. Can I measure the one I've already done to get an idea of how much ease I want? Or would that not work because of how much heavier the whole thing is? So this is such a great question. And there are definitely some things to think about. So is it a good starting point? 100%. I would absolutely take those measurements and take those into consideration when choosing my size of this sport weight cardigan. So here's the only thing you really need to think about. Depending on how much space the fabric itself takes up on our body, we have to make room for that. So this cardigan that you really like the fit of that was knit out of super bulky, that's taking up extra space because it's knit out of super bulky yarn. So you need extra ease to make up for that extra space the garment itself is taking up. Sport weight is going to be considerably different. It's not going to take up as much space, so it's going to leave you with extra ease if you were to do the same exact measurements as you have in your bulky garment. So I would recommend dropping down a little bit, but I mean an inch, you know? Also remember that knit fabric is flexible. It's much more forgiving than a tightly woven fabric. So you do have some wiggle room there, but a good rule of thumb is the bulkier the yarn, the more ease you need to think about, because the fabric itself is taking up some of the space of that ease. So you're not, so if I had 10 inches of positive ease in 2 garments, but one was knit in super bulky and one was knit in sport weight, the super bulky one isn't actually giving me a full 10 inches of positive ease around my body, because it in and of itself is taking up some of that space. It's also going to affect drape. I don't know how you knit your super bulky cardigan. Is it really open and airy, or are those stitches dense and tight? So depending on how that was knit, it could be a highly structured garment that's kind of stiff and holds its shape, or it could be a drapier fabric. I think it's only going to get so drapey when it's knit more bulky. I think in general, a sport weight fabric is going to have more drape than your bulky. So that's another thing to take in consideration, is really looking at the pictures of the other pattern you're considering and trying to compare the two and looking at, okay, what does the drape look like? Because that'll kind of just help you envision the fabric and how it's going to drape on a body compared to your bulky one. But I still think it's a great starting place to look at the measurements of your bulky one and to see, since you do like how that fits, and to kind of use that as a guideline, and just know you're not going to need quite so much ease with a sweater that's knit out of a finer yarn, and the sweater that's knit out of the finer yarn might drape more on your body than that bulky knit does. If anybody else wants to weigh in on that one, I think it's a fun conversation and really interesting to think about just how different fabrics lay on us. All right, I have to take another drink of this water. I'm like trying to fight the urge. I don't know what this is that I get so thirsty. Well, I wish I could mute so you don't have to listen to me drink. Maybe you'll do me a favor and you'll have a drink with me. Pick up that coffee or that tea or your bottle of hydrating, delicious water that you're so thirsty for, and just cheers. That's good. You know what else sounds really good right now? It's a fizzy water. I love a fizzy water. Like a nice, good, well, I won't drop any brand names. I don't know. Anyways, I could use a little fizzy water. It just quenches your thirst like nothing else. Like in the summertime, especially, I used to live in Austin, and oh my gosh, I would ride my bike. My commute to work, if you will, was 9 miles, and I would ride my bike and it would be 100 degrees, and then I would go work in a 100 degrees bakery. It was always so hot, and the only thing that could quench my thirst was fizzy water, because those bubbles would just like, they would just like refresh and kind of like clear out your throat from all that hot heat. All right, let's get back to knitting. Question number 4. I am an advanced beginner, but I always have a hard time with twisting my cast-on edge when I go to join in the round. I know you have mentioned many times for the tubular cast-on to use straight needles, but I've had to frog a regular cast-on many times just because all those stitches just spin around the circular cable. I only have a problem when I'm doing sweater cast-ons, as there's just so many stitches. Any helpful tips? And isn't that the worst? It's like, of course it's only a struggle when you've just cast on probably a few hundred stitches. It takes a half an hour to cast them on, and then they twist. So just to know, you are not alone. I do this for a living, and I still twist my cast on from time to time. It just happens. One thing I will say is maybe check the circumference of the needle you're using, because if it is a little small to accommodate the amount of stitches that you are casting on, then it can be a little harder to keep them all facing the right direction. I just realized I'm like wiggling my foot, and I think it's wiggling the desk. Sorry. Because they're crammed so close together, they can start to spiral around your cord. So maybe consider that. Really choose a cord that evenly kind of, you can evenly spread those stitches out. And what I do is as I'm working, you have to keep pushing the stitches around your needle, right? So they're going to wiggle, they're going to move a little. So every couple inches, I recheck and make sure that they're all still, like I always make sure the butt of my cast on, like the cast on edge, is in the middle of my needle. And I just make sure they're all still facing that way. And it's especially important to check that one more time right before you get to the end of the cast on, because you basically have one last chance to fix it before you jump that gap for the second time after joining in the round. So you jump the gap to join in the round, right? And just keep an eye that whole time that you're knitting around that round that all those little butts stay in the middle. And then right when you get back to the gap to your beginning of round again, that is your last chance where you could technically twist them back to the way they need to be, and it's not going to be very noticeable in your cast on edge. But that's it. That's like your last chance before you're going to have to recast on. So that's the best tip I could think of, was to kind of watch your cord length. But if anybody else has any good ideas on how they manage not twisting those stitches, I mean, I'll tell you what, it's one of those things that I think most of us learn pretty early on, is to always be careful when we're working in the round to not twist our stitches. But I still mention it in pretty much every pattern that I write, like join in the round, taking care not to twist your stitches because it's a constant that we have to work on. But I think that's the best idea I have. If anybody else knows any other clever tricks, please feel free to share them. All right, and today we're going to end on a random little sewing question that I meant to do homework for. What's it called? Oh, I remembered. Woo! Okay. So last week I showed, oh no. Everything's okay. Everything's fine. Okay, so last week I showed my new berry pants that I made into sweatpants. By the way, such a good sew. Highly recommend. I have worn those things every single day. I finally made myself change out of them for this video today. But I made a second pair. I made a navy pair. I now have an entire sweatsuit. Maybe I should have worn that today. The only problem is the same fabric, but the sweatshirt I made myself like 2 years ago and I wear it all the time, so it's pretty faded. And the sweatpants is out of the same fabric, but it's been sitting safe and sound in a cupboard. So I'm like, oh, these are kind of two different colors, but I still love them. But oh my gosh, I love them so much. So I thought that this was a timely question, as I know many of you like to sew as well. It's so fun. I just always feel the most like myself when I'm wearing a total like me-made outfit. I love when I can mix sewing and my knitting because I feel like they complement each other so well. You know, I'm not one to generally knit pants, and so I can sew a pair of pants and then knit my sweater to wear with them. I would love to knit a pair of pants someday, but yeah, I don't know that I will. So, question is, how do you print out your online sewing patterns? Do you use your personal printer and tape the pages together, or do you email it to a printing shop and have them print it on large paper? So it depends. If there's a sewing pattern that I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to knit this. One track mind. I need to sew this right now, today. I will fiddle with the whole printing out the tiles and taping them together. I do not like to do that, and here's why. I like to send them to a printing company. My favorite that I've always used is PDF Plotting. I got that tip from Sew Liberated years and years ago, and usually they will do a discount, or maybe it's free shipping if you, and it's for like $15 or something. So once I have like 3 sewing patterns I want to have printed, I'll do a whole order of a few to save on shipping and stuff like that. But I keep all of my sewing patterns. So what I do is when they're printed out on those giant sheets of paper, I then use, what's it called? I'm looking at it. I can see it from here. It is that, oh man, I remember the PDF Plotting, and now it's on the tip of my tongue. It's that tracing paper that's kind of like fabric. If you know, you know. There's some of you shouting it at me right now. But that is what I then trace up my size with. And here's why. I might want to sew a different size. I might want to make an alteration. I might want to make the same thing for somebody else. So I don't ever cut into my paper patterns. I always use Swedish tracing paper. That's it. Yes. I always use that to actually cut out my pattern, and then I put that on my fabric and cut out my fabric pieces. So it ends up being an extra step, but I save those as well. So for instance, my berry pants, I can't tell you how many pairs I've made. I just have that all cut out on my Swedish tracing paper, but if I ever want to make a different size or anything, I can pull out my big pattern, lay that on the floor and trace out a new size or do an adjustment or something like that. So PDF plotting is where I get that done. Since then, there are loads of places you can get them printed now. I know that U Fabrics does them. So if you want to do one-stop shopping, you can get your fabric, your needles, your elastic, your zippers, and your pattern printed all through them, which is fantastic. And I know that there's other places that like that do it as well. That's just the one that I've seen. So anyways, yeah, I like to do it online. I prefer to get those full sheets printed if I can, instead of doing the tiles, because the tiles are really hard to store and then I feel like I just waste the paper. So yeah, that's how I do it. All right, I do have a little show and tell. So today I'm actually very excited. So after Rhinebeck, many of you know I bought my first fleece and I'm so excited about it. So I washed it all. I was really proud of myself because right after Rhinebeck, we had a random 70-degree weekend. I was like, okay, I have got to get this fleece washed right now because I can let it dry outside. This was a huge fleece. I think it was 10 pounds or something. I split it with my good pal Kate, and so we ended up with around 5 pounds each. I didn't measure, I just roughly split it in half, but I washed all of my side and it has been all laid out in nice little locks ever since. And this morning I went through and I started popping my locks so I can make a bat. So I also got this at Rhinebeck. This is from Clems and Clems. And it is a pop lock. And so it's dirty because I've been using it all morning. But you basically put this in front of you and you pop a lock on there and it opens up the tips. It can open up the end where it got sheared. And so I just did this whole little basket full. I have no idea how much this is. I am gonna weigh it before I turn it into a bat. But I am so excited because I am gonna, I wish you could touch it. I wish you could touch it because it's so lovely. It's like so soft and just like so nice. So anyways, that is that show and tell. I'm really excited. I will update you with my bat. I might even get fancy. I might blend in some Sari silk to add a little color because you know me, I love color. I also, on my desk here, have loads of spindle spun goodies. I just finished up this spin. I cannot wait to ply it. This is 3 of 6 spindles full of, this is called Mooncake, and it's from Melly Knits. And it was burn pile wool that she saved and carded with Sari silk. And it was such a joy to spin. I can't even tell you. I may have shared with some of you, but I've been trying to switch spindle hands, at least learn to become efficient with both hands. And this fiber was so easy to spin that I could easily switch hands, and I didn't feel like I was all 2 left feet or what have you. And then I have just other random, this is all done. I need to ply it. This is a little sample, also from Melly Knits. This is one of her glow, which is merino with silk. And so I'm really excited to ply and swatch this. I am hesitant with silk. I love Sari silk because I love the color that you can add. Like all of these have some Sari silk in them, but silk can be really challenging to draft. So I'm really curious about this because the silk is totally blended in, so you don't get any crazy hard to draft pieces. And I guess that's it. Yep, everything else is kind of in a mess, halfway done. I am onto the sleeves of a new cardigan design. So cross your fingers and your toes for me, because it's one of those ones that I'm not gonna know if it works until I'm done knitting it. Why do I do this to myself? Where you're just like, you can't know until all the components are together. That's when you get to find out if it works. So it's a lot of lead time to something that might not work out. But I feel pretty good about it. I'm excited about it. I'm hopeful. So I guess that's all I got. I think I might try and get a new project on my loom this weekend. That's one of my goals for the weekend, is to card up a bat and to get a project on my loom. It has been a long time since I did any weaving. And I know I just need to do it. I just need to make the time. I know the second I have it dressed, no problem. I'll just sit down, throw a couple, and it'll be so great. So, okay. I'm just rambling now, so I will let you go. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope to see you back here next week. Feel free to answer a question through the link below. As always, you can find the questions that were asked this week along with any pertinent links in the show notes below. If you are enjoying this and my video tutorials, please feel free to hit the subscribe and like buttons, as that always helps us out. Have a great weekend. Carve out some time to make something. And thanks for being here. Bye.